Every era in history has had its ultimate weapon. Not missiles, not warships, not nuclear arsenals. The most powerful weapon of any civilization has always been its currency. In the modern world, wars are no longer fought only on physical battlefields. They are fought through markets, through sanctions, through trade agreements, and through financial systems built over decades. And at the dead center of this economic battlefield stands one currency, the US dollar. Want to buy oil? You need dollars. Seeking an international loan? Dollars. Running cross-border trade? Dollars. Cutting off a rival nation economically? The mechanism still runs through the dollar. Even when a currency weakens, we measure its fall against the dollar. When people say the rupee is declining, what they really mean is, the rupee is losing value compared to the US dollar. That is how embedded this currency has become. It is the world's financial measuring stick. But here's the question worth asking. How did this happen? Because if you rewind history, the US dollar was not always this dominant. Before World War I, it barely circulated beyond American borders. The United States didn't even have a central bank until 1913. So how did a currency with essentially zero global standing become the backbone of the entire world economy within just a few decades? And more importantly, is this dominance built on something real? The dollar is not backed by gold today. It is not backed by oil or any natural resource. Yet nearly every country in the world holds dollars in reserve, prices its exports in dollars, and borrows money denominated in dollars. Is this purely American power? Or has the dollar become so deeply embedded in the global system that leaving it is practically impossible, no matter how much countries want to? What happened to nations that tried to challenge the dollar? How did 2 world wars hand America the financial throne? And what will it take to unseat it? That is what this documentary is about. To understand how the dollar became what it is today, we need to go back, much further than Bretton Woods, much further than World War II. We need to go back to a time before money itself existed. In the earliest human settlements, there were no banks, no coins, and no paper notes. Trade was conducted through what we call the barter system, a direct exchange of goods and services. You had grain, your neighbor had goats, and if your needs aligned, you made a deal. The barter system sounds simple, and in small communities, it was. But it had a fundamental flaw that economists describe as the double coincidence of wants. You could only complete a trade if the other party happened to need exactly what you were offering, at exactly the same time you needed what they had. Imagine a blacksmith who needs food, but the farmer doesn't need any metal work done. The trade cannot happen, even if both parties have things of value. Barter worked for small, close-knit groups. It could not sustain the complexity of growing civilizations. This limitation forced human societies to get creative. They began looking for a medium, something that everyone would accept in exchange for anything, and that could be stored for future use. The search for this universal medium is what gave birth to money. The first step beyond barter was commodity money, using physical goods that had inherent value and were widely desired. Gold, silver, copper, salt, shells, and even livestock served as early currencies in different parts of the world. What made these commodities work as money was a combination of scarcity, durability, and universal desirability. Gold didn't rot, silver didn't dissolve, salt was essential for preserving food. These materials could be stored, transported, and traded across cultural boundaries without losing their appeal. But even commodity money had its inefficiencies. How much gold is a camel worth? How do you make change? How do you ensure the piece of silver you're receiving hasn't been shaved or adulterated? The solution came around 600 BC, from a small but influential kingdom in what is now Western Turkey. The Kingdom of Lydia introduced what historians widely regard as the world's first standardized coin-based currency, the Lydian stater. Made from electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, these coins were stamped with official symbols guaranteeing their weight and purity. This was a revolutionary development. For the first time, you didn't need to weigh and test your money every time you used it. The state had certified it, you could trust it. And because everyone trusted it, everyone accepted it. The idea of standardized coinage spread rapidly through Persia, Greece, Rome, and eventually across the known world. Coins became the financial infrastructure of ancient empires. They funded armies, enabled long-distance trade, and helped states collect taxes systematically. But coins, too, had a ceiling. As trade networks stretched across continents, moving large quantities of gold and silver became dangerous, expensive, and slow. A merchant shipping goods across the Mediterranean or the Silk Road could not practically carry enough coins to settle transactions at scale. Something lighter, something more abstract was needed. The bridge between physical metal and paper currency was built on trust, specifically on the trust between depositors and the institutions that held their wealth. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. A merchant would deposit their gold or silver with a trusted vault keeper, an early bank. In return, they would receive a written receipt confirming the deposit. This receipt could then be handed to someone else's payment, who could in turn present it to the vault and collect the metal. Over time, merchants realized something important. They didn't always need to collect the actual metal. The paper receipt itself was sufficient, as long as people trusted the vault backing it. Receipts began circulating as currency. The idea of paper money had arrived. The world's first formal paper currency was introduced in China during the 11th century under the Song dynasty. The Chinese called it jiaozi. These government-issued notes were lighter than coins, easier to carry in large denominations, and authorized by imperial authority. They transformed commerce in China and represented one of the most significant financial innovations in human history. The concept slowly traveled westward, but Europe, with its deep attachment to tangible metal, was resistant. Paper money felt like a trick, a promise that could be broken. It took centuries and the expansion of international banking before Europeans fully embraced it. The turning point came in 1694 with the establishment of the Bank of England. The bank began issuing paper notes backed by gold reserves, notes that the holder could, in theory, exchange for physical metal. This became the model for modern central banking: paper currency backed by reserves, issued by a trusted institution and accepted universally within the issuing nation. With paper money came a new era of financial possibility. Governments could mobilize resources at scales previously impossible. Merchants could settle transactions across vast distances, and the concept of credit, borrowing against future earnings, could be systematized and expanded. But paper money also introduced a new risk: overissuance. If a government printed more notes than it had gold to back them, the currency's value would erode. This tension between the convenience of paper and the discipline of physical backing would haunt monetary policy for the next 3 centuries. By the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain from a trading nation into the world's most powerful industrial economy. Factories, steam engines, railways, and mechanized production gave Britain an economic lead that no other nation could match. And as Britain's economic power grew, so did the reach of its currency. The British pound sterling became the world's first truly global reserve currency, the financial language spoken in trading posts from Calcutta to Cape Town to Canada. The pound's dominance was structural, not accidental. Britain controlled the world's most extensive network of trade routes, maintained the most powerful naval force on the planet, and ran an empire spanning a quarter of the Earth's surface. Where British ships sailed, British banks followed. Where British banks operated, the pound became the settlement currency. London became the financial capital of the world. British banks financed infrastructure projects on every continent. The London commodity market set global prices for cotton, rubber, tin, and copper. If you wanted to participate in international trade in the 19th century, you needed pounds sterling. The gold standard formalized this arrangement. Under the gold standard, the pound was directly convertible to gold at a fixed rate. This gave holders of pounds absolute confidence in its value. You could always exchange paper for metal. Other nations pegged their own currencies to gold, And since the pound was the dominant trading currency, effective global commerce ran through London. This was the template: a single dominant economy, a single dominant currency, a financial system built around both. Britain had constructed it over 2 centuries of naval, commercial, and industrial supremacy. America would replicate this model, but far more deliberately and far more quickly. And it would take a catastrophe of global proportions to make the transition possible. When the guns of August 1914 began firing across Europe, the global financial order was about to change in ways that no one, not even the strategists and economists of the era, fully anticipated. Britain entered World War I as the world's preeminent financial power. It exited 4 years later, financially shattered. The cost of industrial-scale warfare was staggering, not just in human lives, but in economic resources. Britain borrowed massively from its allies, liquidated foreign investments, and stretched its gold reserves to the breaking point. By the Armistice of 1918, Britain was carrying debt equivalent to roughly 1.3 times its entire GDP, approximately £7.8 billion. Its industrial capacity had been redirected entirely toward war production. Its trade networks were disrupted. The pound, while still nominally the global reserve currency, had lost much of its pre-war strength. Across the Atlantic, a very different story was unfolding. The United States had stayed out of the direct fighting for 3 critical years. During this period, American manufacturers did something extraordinarily lucrative. They sold weapons, food, raw materials, and industrial equipment to the warring nations, particularly Britain and France, on credit. By 1917, when America finally entered the war, it had transformed from a debtor nation into the world's largest creditor. Europe owed America billions of dollars. The financial center of gravity had begun its westward shift. Simultaneously, America had been quietly building the institutional infrastructure needed for global financial leadership. The Federal Reserve System, established in 1913, gave the United States a central banking apparatus capable of managing money supply, setting interest rates, and coordinating with international financial institutions. For the first time, the dollar had the organizational backing needed to compete internationally. World War I didn't hand America global financial supremacy, but it cracked the foundation of British dominance and opened the door. The next war would blow that door completely off its hinges. If World War I weakened Britain, World War II dismantled the entire pre-existing global order. The scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people, an entire generation of its workforce and military. 70,000 villages were completely erased. Industrial output across the USSR fell by nearly 30% year-on-year during the conflict. Germany lay in rubble. France had been occupied and economically gutted. Britain, despite being on the winning side, was effectively bankrupt. Japan, which had spent the 1930s building a Pacific empire, ended the war with 2 of its cities vaporized by atomic bombs and its economy in collapse. China had endured over a decade of brutal Japanese occupation. India, still under British rule, had been drained to fund the imperial war effort. Across Europe and Asia, the physical and financial infrastructure of civilization had been reduced to ash. And then there was America. The United States, protected by 2 oceans from the main theaters of conflict, suffered comparatively minimal destruction on home soil. Pearl Harbor was devastating, but it was an attack on a military base in Hawaii, not on the American mainland. No American city was bombed. No American industry was destroyed. Instead, American industry had been supercharged by the war. The urgency of military production drove unprecedented investment in factories, logistics, and technology. By 1945, the United States was producing more than 50% of the world's total industrial output, from a country with less than 7% of the world's population. The financial picture was equally lopsided. America held approximately 70% of the world's gold reserves. It was owed money by every major allied power. Its dollar was the only major currency that had survived the war with its credibility intact. The world needed to be rebuilt. It needed capital, it needed a stable currency for trade, and it needed institutions that could manage the process. America had all three, and it was determined to use them to redesign the global financial order on its own terms. In July 1944, with Allied victory in Europe still a year away, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The conference lasted 3 weeks. Its decisions reshaped the global financial system for the next 80 years. The Bretton Woods Agreement created a new international monetary order built around a single foundational principle. The US dollar would serve as the world's reserve currency, pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. All other currencies would then be pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. The structure was deliberately hierarchical. Gold backed the dollar backed everything else. Other nations could hold dollars as reserves, confident that they could always be exchanged for gold at the established rate. This gave the dollar the same credibility that gold itself had traditionally provided. The architecture of Bretton Woods went beyond exchange rates. 2 new institutions were created to manage the global financial system. The International Monetary Fund was tasked with monitoring exchange rates, providing emergency loans to countries facing balance of payments crises, and maintaining overall monetary stability. The World Bank was created to fund the rebuilding of war-torn economies. Here is where American strategic genius revealed itself most clearly. Both institutions operated entirely in US dollars. Loans were denominated in dollars. Repayments were collected in dollars. The administrative machinery of global finance was dollar-denominated from the start. Every country that borrowed from the IMF needed dollars to repay. Every nation that participated in Bretton Woods-era trade needed to hold dollar reserves. The system didn't just use the dollar, it required the dollar. Countries were locked in before they fully realized the implications. Then came the Marshall Plan. Beginning in 1948, the United States distributed approximately $13 billion to rebuild Western European economies devastated by the war. The humanitarian motivation was real, but the strategic calculation was equally clear. By funding European recovery in dollars, America ensured that its currency would circulate throughout the Western world. Within 2 decades of Bretton Woods, the transformation was complete. Global trade was priced in dollars. Foreign currency reserves worldwide were held primarily in dollars. International debt was issued in dollars. The dollar had become not just a currency, but the infrastructure of global economic life itself. The Bretton Woods system was elegant in its design, but it contained a fatal structural flaw, one that America's own choices would expose. The gold-dollar link worked as long as the United States held enough gold to cover the dollars in circulation internationally. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, this wasn't a problem. America held the vast majority of the world's gold, and global dollar circulation was still relatively contained. But through the 1950s and 1960s, the United States was spending on a scale that would have been inconceivable to previous generations. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, military bases in dozens of countries, foreign aid programs, all of it required dollar expenditures, and the dollars went global. As American spending pumped dollars into the world economy, foreign governments accumulated dollar reserves in enormous quantities. And here is where the math began to break down. By 1960, the total amount of dollars held by foreign governments already exceeded the value of gold sitting in US vaults. The system had been quietly broken. If every foreign government holding dollars simultaneously demanded their gold at the agreed $35 per ounce, the United States could not deliver. The promise at the heart of Bretton Woods was no longer physically keepable. Making the situation worse, the open market price of gold had started rising above $35 per ounce. This created a textbook arbitrage opportunity. A country could exchange $35 at the official rate for 1 ounce of gold, then sell that ounce on the open market for more than $35, pocketing the difference. America was effectively subsidizing anyone willing to drain its gold reserves. In 1961, the United States formed the London Gold Pool with 7 European allies. The pool's purpose was to collectively sell gold onto the open market when prices rose above $35, suppressing demand and maintaining the official rate. It was a holding action, not a solution, and it was accelerating America's gold depletion rather than stopping it. By the late 1960s, France had begun systematically converting its dollar reserves into gold, shipping physical bullion back from the United States. Other nations followed. In 1950, the United States held approximately 20,000 metric tons of gold. By 1971, that figure had fallen to roughly 8,000 metric tons. America had lost more than half its gold in 2 decades, drained away through a system it had designed but could no longer sustain. By the summer of 1971, the situation was reaching its breaking point. Foreign governments were accelerating their requests to convert dollar holdings into gold. The London Gold Pool had already collapsed in 1968. American gold reserves were falling at an unsustainable rate. President Richard Nixon faced a binary choice: defend the gold standard and watch the United States exhaust its reserves entirely, or abandon gold convertibility and accept the consequences of breaking the foundational promise of Bretton Woods. On the evening of August 15, 1971, Nixon addressed the nation on television. In a speech framed around domestic economic concerns, inflation, unemployment, trade deficits, he included one sentence that changed the global monetary system permanently. The United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. The gold window was closed. The Bretton Woods system was over. The world financial community was stunned. Economists predicted the dollar's collapse. Currency markets went into turmoil. European governments protested that America had unilaterally dismantled a system built on mutual agreement without any consultation. The event became known as the Nixon shock. And the shock was real, but the dollar's collapse did not follow. Why? Because by 1971, the dollar had become so deeply embedded in global commerce that there was no practical alternative. International trade was priced in dollars. Foreign reserves were held in dollars. Global debt was denominated in dollars. The SWIFT banking system ran in dollars. The IMF and World Bank operated in dollars. Every country's central bank had built its reserves around the dollar. Switching would require a simultaneous, coordinated global decision to move to an alternative that didn't yet exist. No other currency had the scale, the institutional backing, or the trust needed to replace the dollar overnight, or even over years. The dollar survived the Nixon shock not because it was backed by gold, but because the world had no exit. America had created a system so comprehensive, so deeply integrated into global economic infrastructure, that even removing the gold backing didn't shake its foundations. But Nixon understood something important. Without gold, the dollar needed a new anchor, and he was already working on one. In the aftermath of the Nixon shock, the US dollar was floating freely for the first time in its modern history. It had no gold backing, no fixed exchange rates, and no structural guarantee of its value beyond American economic and military credibility. The question was stark: what would keep global demand for the dollar alive? The answer came from the Middle East, specifically from oil. After World War II, it had become undeniable that oil was the essential fuel of industrial civilization. Every factory, every vehicle, every aircraft, every navy ran on petroleum. And the world's largest known reserves sat beneath the deserts of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE. These nations possessed extraordinary natural wealth, but lacked the technology, capital, and infrastructure to extract and monetize it at global scale. American oil companies had moved in decades earlier, developing the fields and building the pipelines that connected Middle Eastern crude to world markets. This created a relationship of mutual dependency. The Gulf states needed American expertise, capital, and military protection. America needed reliable access to oil and a mechanism to sustain global dollar demand. In 1974, the United States formalized an agreement with Saudi Arabia that would prove to be one of the most consequential deals in modern financial history. Saudi Arabia would price all its oil sales exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, America would provide the Saudi monarchy with military protection, weapons systems, and a guarantee of regime security. The agreement was quickly extended to the broader OPEC membership. Within a short period, virtually all globally traded oil was denominated in US dollars. The strategic implications were profound. Any country in the world that needed to purchase oil, and by the 1970s, there was no industrialized economy that didn't, first needed to acquire US dollars. This created a permanent, structural global demand for the dollar that was entirely independent of American economic performance. The petrodollar system replaced gold as the anchor of dollar dominance. Gold had been a finite physical constraint. Oil was a renewable demand driver. As long as the world ran on petroleum, every oil-importing nation would need dollars. And in 1974, that meant virtually every nation on Earth. America had engineered the most elegant financial trap in history. To participate in the global economy, you had to use the dollar. And to keep using the dollar, you had to keep accepting its terms. With the petrodollar system securing global demand for the dollar, America discovered something that would fundamentally reshape its approach to foreign policy. The dollar wasn't just a currency, it was a weapon. Because nearly all international transactions clear through US-based financial institutions, and because the SWIFT network, which connects virtually every bank in the world, operates primarily in dollars, the United States gained the ability to cut any country off from the global financial system simply by denying it access to dollar clearing mechanisms. This is what financial sanctions mean in practice. When America sanctions a country, it isn't just blocking trade with US companies. It is blocking that country from participating in dollar-denominated transactions anywhere in the world. Any foreign bank that processes a payment for a sanctioned entity risks being cut off from the US financial system. The United States has deployed this weapon repeatedly and with devastating effectiveness. Iran has faced decades of dollar-based sanctions that have crippled its economy. Russia, following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, was cut off from SWIFT and saw its central bank reserves frozen. Hundreds of billions of dollars in assets made inaccessible overnight. North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, the list of countries that have experienced the full force of dollar-based financial exclusion is long. And the pattern is consistent. Isolation from the dollar system means isolation from global commerce, which means economic contraction, inflation, shortages, and political pressure. No military action required. No troops deployed, just the removal of dollar access. This is what makes the dollar uniquely powerful among reserve currencies. The British pound gave Britain financial influence. The dollar gives America financial veto power over the global economy. The difference is enormous. History has been unambiguous in its lesson. Countries that directly challenge the dollar's supremacy tend to face severe consequences. Whether this is coincidence or causation is a matter of ongoing debate, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. In the year 2000, Saddam Hussein's Iraq announced that it would begin pricing its oil sales in euros rather than dollars, a direct challenge to the petrodollar system. The announcement was met with alarm in Washington. 3 years later, the United States invaded Iraq. One of the first acts of the Coalition Provisional Authority after taking control was to switch Iraqi oil sales back to dollar denomination. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi spent years advocating for an African gold-backed currency, the gold dinar, that would allow African nations to trade oil and other commodities outside the dollar system. He was actively building support among African leaders for this initiative. In 2011, a NATO-backed intervention removed him from power. Iran, which has persistently sought to trade oil in currencies other than the dollar, has faced relentless economic pressure through sanctions, banking exclusions, and diplomatic isolation. Venezuela, which attempted to launch a state-backed cryptocurrency partly as a mechanism to circumvent dollar-based sanctions, saw its economy deteriorate under an escalating campaign of U.S. financial pressure. In each of these cases, the countries involved had serious internal problems that contributed to their difficulties. The dollar was not the only factor, but the timing and pattern of consequences for countries that move against the petrodollar system have been consistent enough that most nations choose not to openly challenge it. The message has been received. Challenging the dollar is not simply an economic decision. It carries political and security implications that most governments are unwilling to absorb. For decades after Bretton Woods, dollar dominance was essentially unchallenged. The Soviet Union's ruble existed in a parallel system, largely isolated from global trade. Europe's currencies were fragmented until the euro's introduction in 1999. No single alternative had the size, liquidity, or institutional backing to compete. But in the 21st century, the landscape has begun shifting. Slowly, cautiously, and with the full awareness of what happened to previous challengers, but shifting nonetheless. China has been the most significant force in this quiet challenge. The renminbi's share of global trade settlement has been rising steadily. China has established bilateral currency swap agreements with dozens of countries, allowing trade to occur without passing through dollar clearing systems. The CIPS payment system, China's alternative to SWIFT, has been expanding its membership and transaction volumes. Russia, cut off from much of the Western financial system after 2022, has accelerated its pivot away from the dollar. Trade with China, India, and parts of the Middle East has increasingly settled in local currencies. Russia's gold reserves have grown as it reduced its dollar holdings. The BRICS nations have repeatedly discussed creating a common currency or reserve mechanism that could serve as an alternative to the dollar for trade among member nations. While a formal BRICS currency remains distant, the political will to explore alternatives is real and growing. Perhaps most significantly, Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar arrangement, has begun publicly discussing the possibility of accepting non-dollar payments for some oil sales. In 2023, Saudi officials confirmed that the kingdom was open to considering alternative currencies for oil transactions. This is not a small development. None of these developments have yet dislodged the dollar from its central position. The renminbi is not freely convertible. There is no credible BRICS currency. Saudi Arabia has not formally abandoned dollar pricing. The dollar still constitutes roughly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves. But the trajectory has changed. The unquestioned consensus that the dollar is permanent has given way to a world where alternatives are being actively explored, developed, and, in some bilateral trade relationships, already used. Given everything, the growing resentment of American financial power, the active efforts to build alternatives, the declining share of global GDP that the United States represents, why does the dollar remain dominant? The answer lies in what economists call network effects. The dollar is useful precisely because everyone uses it. And because everyone uses it, it remains the most useful option. Breaking this cycle requires simultaneous, coordinated action by a large portion of the global economy, which is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Consider the practical challenges of moving away from the dollar. A country that decides to price its exports in a different currency immediately faces a problem. Its trading partners may not want to hold that currency. The partner country would need to build reserves in the new currency, which means selling something else, likely dollars, to acquire it. For a replacement currency to work globally, it needs deep financial markets where large volumes can be traded without moving prices. It needs a legal and regulatory framework that international investors trust. It needs a central bank willing to supply the currency in quantity during crises. And it needs enough adoption that the network effect reinforces itself. The renminbi fails several of these tests. China maintains capital controls, limiting the free flow of renminbi across its borders. Foreign investors cannot freely buy and sell Chinese government bonds or financial assets. China's legal system does not enjoy the same international credibility as American courts for resolving commercial disputes. The euro, which comes closest to meeting these criteria, still represents only about 20% of global reserves, a distant second to the dollar's 60%. And Europe's political divisions raise questions about the long-term coherence of Eurozone governance. So the dollar persists, not because the world enthusiastically endorses American financial leadership, but because the cost and complexity of building a credible alternative exceeds the benefits for any individual actor. Each country that continues using the dollar makes it slightly more rational for the next country to do the same. The trap reinforces itself with every transaction. Every great financial empire in history has eventually been replaced. The Lydian stater gave way to Greek coinage. Roman currency collapsed with the empire. The Spanish real dominated global trade for 2 centuries before fading. The British pound reigned supreme for over 100 years before surrendering to the dollar after World War II. The question is not whether the dollar's era will end. History makes clear that no currency rules forever. The question is when, how, and what comes next. There are scenarios under which the transition could happen faster than most expect. A severe U.S. fiscal crisis, driven by the accumulation of government debt now exceeding $35 trillion, could erode confidence in America's ability to service its obligations. A major geopolitical miscalculation could accelerate de-dollarization efforts. A credible digital currency backed by a coalition of nations could provide the alternative that currently doesn't exist. There are equally compelling scenarios under which dollar dominance persists for decades longer. The United States remains the world's largest economy by many measures. American capital markets are by far the deepest and most liquid in the world. U.S. Treasury bonds remain the global safe haven asset of choice during every financial crisis. In times of fear, the world runs to dollars, not away from them. What seems certain is that the world is entering a period of gradual, contested transition, not from dollar dominance to a clear successor, but from unchallenged dollar hegemony to a more multipolar financial system where the dollar remains important but no longer uncontested. This matters for every country, every investor, and every ordinary person. Because the currency that dominates global trade shapes the prices you pay, the interest rates on your loans, the stability of your own nation's currency, and the geopolitical leverage your government has, or doesn't have, on the world stage. The dollar became dominant through war, diplomacy, institutional design, and raw economic power. It has maintained that dominance through structural lock-in, military credibility, and the absence of credible alternatives. Its future will be determined by whether the forces building those alternatives can overcome the enormous inertia of the existing system. The British pound was once exactly where the dollar is now, indispensable, unassailable, eternal, until it wasn't. The dollar's story is not over, but understanding how it was written, chapter by chapter, war by war, deal by deal, is the only way to read what comes next.